Hello everyone and welcome to my new video. Today I'm actually going to be doing kind of a continuation of one of my more popular videos on my channel where I went over 4 very simple beginner stitches for embroidery. Now I've actually learned quite a few more stitches since then and I think I've gotten relatively okay at it. So I actually wanted to kind of tack onto that and add a couple more stitches that I think can be really easy for beginners and just kind of continue moving down that road and seeing how many stitches I can get good at and see how many I can share as well, and maybe even start doing some more embroidery designs. So with that said, here I am putting in this plain white fleece that I have from an old video. This is from my Vulpix onesie actually. I have it nice and tight. I screwed it in pretty good and pulled the edges just to make sure that it was as tight as possible. And I'm also going to use this magic pen. It fades a little bit when it's in contact with the air, and with water it completely disappears. So I'm going to be using this to start adding my details and whatnot. This is a pretty inexpensive tool. I know in my last video I actually used pen because I didn't even know things like this existed and I needed it to be visible on camera for you all. So I'm really glad that I found this sort of tool. Not to mention it's like super cool to just kind of like lick your finger and dot onto the embroidery hoop and just watch it all disappear. I'm just picking out my embroidery threads. I wanted to pick 3 pretty distinct colors. I was thinking of going with brown and then ended up going with a pretty bright yellow. This is a color palette I don't normally go with, so I thought it'd be fun to do something different for a change. And here I am just going to cut it off, and I have a hard time threading my needles. I've heard tons and tons of ways to do it, but honestly I find usually the easiest way is to just kind of lick the ends, make it nice and flat, and then stick each of the pieces through in like a flat row. I'll knot it off at the end, and I will not tie it around the needle just to make it easy to go through. Now, I think it might actually be time to get started. So on this first line, I'm going to do what is called a chain stitch. Now, I've seen people do this a couple of different ways. I'm going to show you like the easiest, most basic way possible to do this. I also think that this is a nice and easy way to actually get started and keep the chains really even. I found the other ways don't help me keep things as even. So what I'm doing here is I'm showing you what a normal stitch would look like. You would come up through the back and you would go straight down, and it sort of forms this straight line. And this is kind of what you would imagine like a classic running stitch would be. I'm also just kind of doing this to frame a little bit and maybe emphasize a little bit of the differences. But all you'll have to do is you'll actually just go up through the back right at the end of the last stitch. Pull it all the way through, and then you're going to come back down once you have everything pulled through and go like right next to it. I've seen some people go straight in, but I think this is easier like if you make a mistake that you can pull the loop back out, because you're not going to pull your thread all the way through. You are just going to pull it until you have a little bit of a loop left. Now you can leave a really long loop if that's what you like to do. I try to kind of take it down to about the size that I want so that I can kind of measure out how long the stitch is going to be. And I think that that's about the length that I want. And then once you have that, you're going to stick up through the end where that loop is and kind of catch it on the loop. And as you tighten it, the loop will actually tighten around and create a nice, like even rice length stitch. And basically you're just going to continue doing that. Once you have your loop kind of tacked down, all you have to do is go back through that hole again, measure it out, come back up through that loop that you created, go back through the hole you just made, leave a loop, measure it out, come back up through the hole of the loop, and tighten it up again. And that is the beginnings of a basic chain stitch. So I did the rest of it off camera. As you can see, it's a little bit wibbly wobbly. This is not my favorite stitch to use, but I definitely think it can create some really cool like lavender or like maybe even like wheat kind of grassy textures if you're doing florals. So I'm going to move on to the next one and not dwell too long on this older one here. I think I'm going to use the yellow thread for this one. This is going to be what's called couching. Now, couching is not necessarily a stitch in and of itself, but kind of a method for attaching thicker yarns to a piece of embroidery. So if you have like a really beautiful piece of ribbon or a really thick piece of yarn or string that just will not go through your embroidery hoop or through your fabric rather, couching is a way to attach it. Now, if you are trying to make it kind of seamless, you might prefer to use an embroidery hoop needle thread, embroidery thread. That's what I was going for. that matches. I'm going to use the yellow here, obviously, to kind of have a little bit more of a contrast. And kind of like I just demonstrated with my fingers, you're basically just going to go up and around and up and around and up and around as many times as you need to stitch it down and tack it down pretty successfully. The hardest part, I think, for this one is getting the ends, especially because I have some really fluffy yarn here. You just go up one side, and I'm trying to make this straight, if not slightly diagonal, all the way down. So I'm going up through the bottom, and then bringing it back down on top at the same point. So it kind of creates this like almost train tracks effect. Now I'm kind of finding my hole again, coming in through the back, pulling it up all the way, finding the point at the top that is exactly the same as the bottom, and creating a nice vertical stitch that way. From the front, it looks really straight. You'll notice a little bit later when I flip it around that you're going to see it actually kind of looks more diagonal on the back. And obviously, if you wanted to couch in that way, that is totally up to you. You can use different stitches over top of it. You can go diagonal if that's what you want. All of it's really up to your personal preference. And I also just kind of wanted to throw in here, when I do my knotting, I always like to use my needle to kind of help me guide my knots together and tie it off on the back so that it's nice and tight before I take it off. And yeah, I think that works out pretty well. The last one we're going to do here is the satin stitch, and I'm using this like blood orange thread for that. Does anyone know that TV show or that Vine that's pulled from that TV show where the girl's like, oh, it's that blood orange color, and the guy's like, blood orange, it's red. And that's what I think of every time I look at this color for some reason. So I'm just going to take this thread and very simply I'm going to go up at the bottom point and straight up into another vertical stitch. Now this can go in several different ways. You can do it horizontally, you can do it diagonally. It doesn't really matter. The whole point of this type of stitch is to fill in space. And I think I like doing this more than using different fabrics to fill in space because I think it creates such a beautiful texture, and I think that the direction of the thread can really do some really cool effects. For instance, if you're doing leaves, if you do it diagonal in the upward left direction on the left side and then diagonal in the upward right on the right side, it kind of creates that natural indent in the center of the leaf. That it's just a really cool texture, and I really like this technique. It's probably my preferred when it comes to filling in spaces, like I said. And really the gist of it is to go up and down and up and down. At the very beginning, you can start from the bottom and go up and then go back to the bottom and go up, but that's going to use double the amount of thread. So as you can see here, I like to kind of go in from the bottom up to the top, and then I come back in through the top and then go back down to the bottom. That way I'm wasting less thread. And especially when you're filling in big spaces, saving thread is pretty important. I know it's not super expensive, but I think it does make a difference. I also sometimes like to, as you can see here, kind of create little sections that I'll fill in before moving on to the next part. So I'll make like lines that are pretty spaced apart and then come back and fill them in later. And by the time you're done, it should look something like this. Like I said, I love the texture. I think all of these add some really, really cool texture to embroidery pieces that you just don't get from doing your basic running stitches. I think my favorite stitch is still the split stitch by far. If you don't know how to do that one, you can check out this video up here. I think it's probably my favorite aesthetically and to complete because it's really forgiving. If you want to know what I'm talking about, definitely go check out that video. I think embroidery is a super beautiful way to do things, and you can make some creative choices like having felt here or using satin stitches to fill things in, thicker threads, thinner threads, single threads, 6-string threads, whatever it is. But eventually things will come together and you can start creating your own designs like I did here. I think embroidery is probably my favorite form of art up to this point. I think the texture is what makes it so beautiful, and the fact that there's so many different ways to create so many different looks really gives the craft its merit. So if you are still learning like I am, feel free to try this out, and hopefully I will see you next week in another video. I think I'm going to save this bottom portion to finish up. Subscribe and like the video if you like what you saw, and then hopefully you can see when I do another embroidery type video and show you some more decorative stitches. Thanks again for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Bye!